Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Spencer Zipchak. I'm President of Liberty Victoria, and Liberty is very pleased in association with others to have organised this seminar this evening. I want to mention two people in particular, Mary Lou Gilbert, who is the Director of 45 Downstairs, and obviously, and he will be known to many of you, Dinos Moses. Mary Lou and Dinos are long-term members of Liberty Victoria, and I think I can say without fear of contradiction, two of its most generous supporters, and it's a great pleasure to collaborate with them in the presentation of this seminar this evening. We're privileged to be addressed here by Professor Van Coufoudakis. Dinos 3 days ago sent me a copy of Professor Coufoudakis' curriculum vitae. It's the kind of curriculum vitae that if you sought to even allude to a quarter of it, it would take all of the time that we have this evening. So I intend to be just a trifle more selective if I may. Professor Coufoudakis is the Dean Emeritus of the College of Arts and Sciences at Indiana University. He's the Rector Emeritus of the University of Nicosia in Cyprus. He's the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Indiana University, Purdue. He conducts his research in the fields of US foreign policy, international organizations, international relations, and has a particular interest in Eastern Mediterranean issues, focusing, unsurprisingly, given the topic of this evening's seminar, on Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, about which he's written extensively. I had the good fortune to have dinner with Dinos and Van on Saturday evening. It was a very engaging and fascinating conversation, during the course of which he alerted me to the fact that, in addition to all of these other honours, he had been given the Commander of the Order of the Phoenix by the President of the Hellenic Republic. That's impressive enough, but even more impressive was the fact that 30 years earlier he had been repudiated by the President of the Hellenic Republic, this being at the time of the Greek military junta, where you could be repudiated just for being in the United States and writing something critical of the junta's governance. That, I expect, in part explains his long-term interest in human rights and civil liberties. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Professor Van Coufoudakis.
I'll sit down. If you can't hear me, I'll stand up. I was looking through the computer about Liberty Victoria, although I knew about your group, we had met before. I was very impressed by the range of activities that Liberty Victoria does, and by the motto of this organization that says the price of justice is eternal vigilance, which to me presents a major challenge, because as we all know, whether you live in the US, Australia, or in countries of the Middle East right now, where the struggle for liberation, human rights, freedoms, and so on continues to go on, that's exactly what we should be talking about, vigilance, protect our freedoms, and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, because Australia has been involved in United Nations peacekeeping and peacemaking in Cyprus, you're connected to the Cyprus problem, whether you like it or not. The good news is that even though there have been all sorts of foreign contingents that have gone through Cyprus over the years, the Australian police contingent that has been part of the UN peacekeeping force receives accolades for the manner in which it has conducted itself. Fair, just, proper, compared to others who used to steal things in Cyprus and things like that. For example, the representative of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, for example, was caught in 1979 using vehicles of the UN peacekeeping force to steal antiquities and sell them abroad. And Kurt Waldheim, the former Secretary General, friend of this, an Austrian himself, friend of the Austrian gentleman who was stealing the goodies, saved him from going to jail, things like that. But the Australian contingent has been marked by fairness, and so you should be very proud of that. The other issue that at least connects me to Liberty Victoria and to the issue of human rights that preoccupies you as well is the fact that in Cyprus, leaving aside the issue of the invasion, the continuing occupation, and so forth, there are major issues of human rights that have affected the Cyprus problem from day one. And I'll simply list them. If you want to talk about these things, we will talk about them later. But you have things like ethnic cleansing, you have the rights of refugees and the displaced, you have rape and inhuman treatment, property confiscation, missing persons, foreign settlers who are not economic refugees or political refugees. You have the destruction of the cultural heritage. So these are the kinds of issues that you can find in discussing Cyprus and the current dimensions of the Cyprus problem. So therefore, even though my approach tonight is going to discuss more or less the evolution of the Republic of Cyprus over a 50-year period, because the 50th anniversary was very recent, the Cyprus issue is directly related to issues of human rights, and actually one of my books was written exactly on that very topic. I hope, some people have read it, I don't know. Anyway, let me close with one comment, negative for Australia. You have Alexander Downer, of course, the foreign minister, who seems to be now working for another master, the United Nations, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And he seems to be oblivious to issues of human rights, European law, the European Convention on Human Rights. And Alexander Downer is going to find out, much like some of his predecessors did, that the Greek Cypriot Republic is not going to fall from the track he's setting up for them. Again, we can talk about these things if you want to later on. I hope I have not offended any friends of Alexander Downer. But, that's the reality. I know the man from his days as foreign minister. He was different when he was in Adelaide, elected from an Adelaide-based audience compared to what he is now, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, the 50 years of the Republic of Cyprus. In 1960, when Cyprus gained its independence from Britain, a lot of people described Cyprus as the reluctant republic, because the Cypriots did not want to become independent. They wanted to unite with Greece. And they saw that in the context of self-determination and the choice, of course, of uniting with their motherland, culturally, historically, and so on. It didn't happen because during the course of the anti-colonial struggle, Turkey got involved thanks to the British diplomatic service, and the end result was that the choice was between partition and independence. Rather than being partition, Cypriots chose to be independent. The only problem was they were handed the independence documents. They did not have part in negotiating the independence agreements. They did not have a voice in shaping the constitution that was based on the independence agreements. So in many ways, independence was jinxed from day one. And as I said, Cyprus became the reluctant republic, the 100th member of the UN in 1960. In October, when Cyprus celebrated its 50th anniversary, celebrations in Cyprus were rather subdued. They had a parade, they had speeches and all that kind of stuff. And of course, it was marked by the absence of any Turkish Cypriots from the celebrations about the 50th anniversary of the Republic, which also showed the kind of contempt that the Turkish Cypriots have for the Republic they want to be part of. So, another interesting little sideline. But it also reminded me that in 1960, when Cyprus became independent, because of the connection of wanting to unite to Greece rather than become independent, the independence celebrations in 1960 were also rather low-key. So history repeats itself 50 years later, you know. But yet, even though gaining independence in 1960 was the first important step, maintaining and consolidating that independence became even a greater challenge in view of what Cyprus faced from 1960 on. Now, in this particular case, the 1959 Zurich and London agreements these are the agreements that gave Cyprus its independence, were negotiated between Greece, Turkey, and England. The Cypriots did not negotiate. They were told to accept them, or if they rejected the agreements, they would be partitioned. The partition plan was by Macmillan, the then Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and the end result was that they received a kind of a dysfunctional constitution that nobody knew whether it would work and how. Now, the other characteristic of Cyprus at independence was that they really did not have much experience in national and international affairs. The Cypriot elite was a highly educated elite, there's no doubt about that. But their political experience had been at the local level, local government, local issues, or the question of self-determination. Suddenly, these people become government leaders. They have to develop an international personality. They have to develop a foreign policy. They have to do all these kinds of things. So that was the first major challenge that they faced. And then they had those dysfunctional constitutions with minority vetoes, minority votes, separate from those of the majority, that blocked the effective work of the Cypriot political institutions. Now, critics, since the collapse of the original constitution of Cyprus of 1963, critics have said, well, you know, if the Greek Cypriots were a bit more flexible, things perhaps wouldn't have gone that way. It's nice to say that from far away. I suggest for people who really don't know the details of what happened between 1960 and December of 1963, to take a look at some of the material that's available in that period. There's a very excellent study done by Stanley Smith, an English constitutional lawyer, who pretty much finds the Constitution of Cyprus and the agreements that gave its independence to be unique, unprecedented, and impossible to work. But, you know, sometimes now we tonight rather critical of diplomacy of my own country. In 1959, in July of 1959, months after the independence agreements were handed down to Cyprus, the Intelligence and Research Bureau of the U.S. Department of State did an analysis of the independence agreements. This is one of the most prophetic documents that has ever been written about Cyprus. Because in July of 1959, a year before the actual independence of Cyprus, American analysts from the State Department said, those agreements will fail, and they will fail for the following reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here is why the failure will come about. And by Jove, come December 1963, the constitutional crisis came about because the deadlocks developed the way pretty much the intelligence and research analysis from the Department of State had predicted it would. Anybody who had any notion about Cyprus knew what was going to happen. Now, the problem was that once the constitutional crisis came about in 1963, all sorts of other external forces got involved in Cyprus. There was destabilization of the Cyprus government, a lot of external interference from the United States, from Britain, from Turkey, you name it. And the end result was that Cyprus had to stabilize itself, maintain a legitimate government in place, and then fight at the international front threats that they faced for like threats for the intervention of Turkey in Cyprus and so on. Turkey, by the way, the southern Turkish military bases are 40 miles north of the island of Cyprus. Well, the Security Council in March of 1986, in March of 1964, passed a very significant unanimous resolution defining the legitimacy and the continuity of the Republic, sending also the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus, and setting the stage for the internationalization of the Cyprus problem. It also appointed mediators to help resolve the constitutional crisis in Cyprus. So, both the peacekeeping and the peacemaking activity of the UN dates back to March 1964. The reality was that Cyprus, while struggling to survive as an independent state in 1963-64 out of that constitutional crisis, it also tried to develop institutions, procedures compatible to those of any Western democratic European country. That's a difficult task to do, balancing external threats with internal institutional developments. And yet, they did that very successfully, and Cyprus by 2004 had become a vibrant liberal democracy, member of the EU. Now, one of the interesting things that I noticed about the first years of the Republic in Cyprus was that despite the problems, external, internal, subversion, and all those kinds of things, the Cypriot economy moved along perfectly well. And one of the interesting things was that despite the ideological diversity of the Cypriot political parties, including one of the largest communist parties in Europe, despite ideological rhetoric, there was consensus on how to run the economy. And that has been the success, I think, of Cyprus, because despite the troubles, the economy grew, the economy helped Cyprus get into the EU, and ideological rhetoric may have been wonderful in the debates in the newspapers, but when it came down to practical economic policy, Marxism went out of the window, So Cyprus is one of those interesting things. Anyway, and I'll make one very quick little parenthesis here. Talking to an Italian diplomat, high-ranking Italian diplomat, soon after the end of the Cold War, he was telling me that Cyprus can make a lot of money. I said, how? He said, tourism. I said, they do that already. He said, no, different kind of tourism. Bring foreign tourists to see what the Communist Party looks like, even in the post-Cold War period. They thought, well, that's a novel idea of approaching the topic. Anyway, what I have been writing about and talking about is, of course, the kind of struggle that Cyprus went through in trying to develop a political entity recognized at the international level, which it is, but at the same time to fight off those who try to subvert it. Because from 1963, the constitutional crisis of 1963 until now, there have been all these foreign mediators who have come to Cyprus, and they speak of reunification, reconciliation, a new constitution, and of course, you have to read the fine print in what they're proposing. And the fine print, of course, has brought about plans like the NATO plan of 1964 that George Ball tried to impose in Cyprus, where the government of Cyprus would be subordinated to a NATO political and military committee, and a NATO peacekeeping force would pretty much come and take over, things that you see today in Bosnia and places like that. Well, that didn't fly very well. George Ball tried to replace the elected government of Cyprus with alternate Cypriot leaders who would play the game, failed. That didn't stop Dean Acheson, the former U.S. Secretary of State, in the summer of 1964, to propose other plans for the solution of the Cyprus problem. Acheson put out, in the summer of 64, 3 specific plans, all of them trying to play up the need to unite Cyprus to Greece, but to give Turkey something it wanted. So 13% of Cyprus is going to be given to Turkey. Greece is going to turn over a number of islands to Turkey, and the remainder of Cyprus is going to be given to Greece, in a manner by which they even violated the Greek constitution. Again, thanks to the guts of President Makarios, the adjustment plan failed. All the plans that followed since then were based on those types of trade-offs, on a lot of constitutional vagueness, and then details like, don't worry about issues about the constitution, later on about the presence of Turkish troops in Cyprus, we can negotiate those later on. But the devil was always in these details. The ABC plan, the 1978 American, British, Canadian plan of Cyprus, again, resolution, reconciliation, and all that, basically wanted to commit the Cypriots to a confederation in Cyprus between two separate autonomous states and negotiate later the details, like would Turkish troops remain in Cyprus, would Turkish settlers remain in Cyprus, would the refugees return to their homes. He said, don't worry about these things, we worry about them later. Well, that's not how you negotiate. But anyway, and the end result was that the reconciliation process has not worked. It's not worked because it has not dealt with the real issues up front in an open and democratic manner. This is why when we got to the situation in 2004 with the Annan Plan, all the talks, all the concessions, all the violations of human rights that the Annan Plan was proposing to do in dissolving the Republic of Cyprus and creating a new state that Richard Holbrooke had dreamed in his mind, we had a case where the Cypriot public found out at the last minute what all those prolonged talks for 2 years had produced. They didn't know. There were leaks in the papers. And one lovely day, they were told that the Annan Plan consisted of 9,000 pages of constitutional technicalities that even lawyers had a difficult time understanding what they were all about. And you're interested in human rights. Do you know that even though Cyprus by 2004 was becoming, of course, a member of the European Community, and Cyprus was ratifying the European Convention on Human Rights, if you were from England, Germany, or any other part of the European Union, you had rights in Cyprus. But Greek and Turkish Cypriots, under the Annan Plan, could not go to the European Court of Human Rights to challenge any provisions about violations of their rights, be they property, personal rights, and things like that. It was that kind of devilish scheme that they had prepared. So the Greek Cypriots, of course, rejected it, because it was, as I said, a confederation of two autonomous states, basically a confederation creating, more or less validating the results of the Turkish invasion. Now, let me just move on and talk a little bit about, because we're talking about what others did and what others did not do and so on. What I would like to stress is that in all the troubled history of the Republic of Cyprus from 1960 independence, the collapse of the constitutional arrangements in 1963, the invasion of Turkey in 1974, and so on, there are good things that have happened in Cyprus in that period of time. And one of the many good things is that Cyprus, as I said to you before, has become a vibrant democratic state, vibrant in its economy, in its society, in its politics. And in 2004, the fact that the government of Cyprus did become a member of the EU said a great deal of how much was achieved under very negative circumstances. Now, another positive development that we have had is that over the years we've had the recognition of the legitimacy of the Republic to become a member of the EU and represent the totality of Cyprus, not just merely the free areas of Cyprus. It shows you the attitude of the European Union toward its member. Second thing, of course, Cyprus has been through political changes. I describe the early period of the Republic of Cyprus as a period of charismatic politics, meaning you had Archbishop Makarios, who became the first elected president of Cyprus. I consider him a charismatic sort of political figure. My friend Dinos Toumazos over there does not, but that's okay. The point is, he's a unique political figure at a unique political time. But he died, he passed away in 1977, natural causes. And from that point on, once charismatic figures go, it allows for other political forces to rise and fill the gaps that existed. So that has been the development of alternate Cypriot political leaders. And also the development of Cypriot political parties, the way political parties function across Europe. That is a very significant development. Then, Cypriot identity has also developed without diminishing the Greek heritage of the largest majority of the Cypriot population. So Cypriots are Cypriots, but they're also very proud of their Hellenic heritage, culture, history, and so on. Also, in the last 50 years, there has been finally an appreciation of the equality between Cyprus and Greece. Because in the early days of the Republic, Greece acted pretty much like a kind of an imperial power. They decided Cypriots were supposed to follow. And of course, that kind of tactic led to the Turkish invasion in 1974, after the Greek junta, my favorite institution that could be court-martial, decided to stage a coup and overthrow the government of the Republic of Cyprus. So the acknowledgement of the equality in the relations between Cyprus and Greece helped a great deal. Then the Parliament of Cyprus has become like any other Western European parliament, particularly after the legislative reforms of 1981. The Cypriot Parliament now is a dynamic political institution functioning with committees, making reports, investigations, and everything else. Then you have electoral politics at all levels of government. For many years, mayors are not elected figures. Now the whole political system, all levels of government, are part of a very vibrant electoral process. And of course we have the rise of civil society, which in any democratic society is very much a part of democracy. Even in Cyprus, where civil society has been funded extensively from outside and for the wrong reasons, it's good to see that civil society has come to life in Cyprus as well. And of course they have developed a very good diplomatic service, which is a good, positive development if you are in trouble and you have to defend and promote your interests abroad. Now, another positive development is the political maturity that has come about in Cyprus. And again, some of you may disagree with me, but in 2008, in the presidential elections in Cyprus, the president that elected, the current president of Cyprus, comes from the Communist Party, Marxist ideology party, that had been marginalized, the party that had been marginalized at key points in the history of Cyprus. But yet, the Cypriot public was willing to elect a person like that,